Hello. First of all, thank you for this opportunity. I'm more than honored to be part of the very first Hasura call. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about the lessons we learned using Hasura for our fintech applications. Before we start, I would like to talk very briefly about us, who we are. Um, I'm managing director of Unrealists. Unrealists is actually found to make people's let's say dream come true. That's the very high level the scope we have. And in a more forward way, we are kind of helping other VCs or other startups to accelerate their complex projects. Okay, and we are focusing on fintech, mobility, insurtech, and proptech. That's our core competencies. Period to founding the Unrealist, me and my co-founder and the partners we have, we founded in total 4 startups and involved around 20 plus startups. So today we're just going to talk about our experience of using Hasura in the scope of fintech. Before we all dive into the topic, I want to just briefly explain what is a fintech, why it is actually what is this domain entails. If your business primarily deals with transferring, storing, or manipulating money or any monetary terms or means, you are a fintech. That is basically the broadest way you can describe a fintech. So what you're doing is primarily dealing with money. Any side project around it is, or for example, payments. Any side project around it is basically your secondary goal. So that's basically your fintech. So it doesn't need to be a bank in general. So what is the differentiator factor in fintech? Why it is different? Why fintech is a bit, let's say, a more let's say specifically important in the startups in general, because unlike other startups, majority of the startups, fintechs are regulated, at least in Germany. So when you're dealing with fintech, you're already restrained a lot. So your ability to move around left and right, it's quite hard. Your innovation is actually kind of checked by lawyers mostly, if you're allowed to do it or not. Also, you are subject to a lot of regulatory bodies like AML, CFT, like PEP, like politically exposed person. You have to check the background of the people you're dealing with. If you don't, you're part of the crime. So that is one of the major differentiator of what makes fintech different. Security is paramount. We are dealing with money. Everyone wants to rob a bank. In online terms, they like to hack a fintech. That's basically the main goals of it. So all aspect of security is important. We majorly see that they are not much taken into regard in fintechs, but it's something you can sacrifice out of it. So fintechs apps must ensure the security within their organization and against their clients. So they need to actually include security part of their design or product culture. Compared to any root-based application or any application that interacts with the client in a very transactional basis, fintechs might deal with, not necessarily, but deal with the complex business flows and often complex data models. You need to deal with multiple different API providers, different data providers, and different complex flows that involve multiple departments to deal with. That's why it's a bit more complicated compared to the other startup types. So MVP of a fintech might look like already an advanced product for another startup type. You're trying to replicate a bank or at least some very high level payment providers, let's say, and competition is quite sharp. So when you're dealing with a fintech application, the standard that is out there is already high. So you have to keep up a specific standard. Trust is a paramount as well. So all in all, it makes it really hard to create yourself different, depict yourself in a different perspective than what other players out there. It's really hard to show yourself that you are the trustworthy place where your money needs to be involved in. That is one of the very hard parts of the fintech. And you have mostly one shot, like for example, in number 26 case, once you get hacked, your life is most likely over. You really need to make a huge sacrifices and organizational refactoring. Sometimes it's not even enough in order to stay in the competition after you get hit by some unfortunate event. Other startups a bit more, let's say, forgiving on that kind of aspects. So a typical fintech startup doesn't have all the bells and whistles of a bank. It does not actually start with what a bank already has. It tries to replicate the business model. It doesn't replicate the banking infrastructure model, which is fine. However, it has some consequences. Domains are mixed. Like in domain-driven design, you really need to separate from what parts of this fintech should do in a very precise manner. For example, in Germany, you're not allowed to make your customer care be in the same room with your credit analysts. So think about the domains of it. So majority of the time, fintech starts with the very same domains. They use one database. Security layers are mixed, applications are mixed, and also you're dealing with a lot of banking providers, payment providers, third-party APIs, often legacy. So many parts that you really need to develop gives you already an overhead that you don't really think about what the proper convention and the setup should be. They think that the accessing to database is yet like for another startup. So control to database is very primitive. So you have some simple users accounts, some tables are granted to it. So very granular access to database is often disregarded. That is how fintech starts in the very first MVP life. Authorization is only against the client. When you're a developer, you can access the database. If you're able to insert a malicious code, you basically get away with it. There is no structural safety net for such actions. And as I said previously, security is paramount. Often ways that you get hacked, one guy internally leaves a backdoor, and that is how you get hacked. So sometimes hacker is actually within the organization. And fintechs are not much protected against it. As I said, many legacy APIs out there, you really need to connect to that, often even not REST, like SWAP, for example. Then you really need to manage different practices in one product. It's very hard to do and keep the agility at the same time. What does Hasura do in terms of mitigating such problems? As Hasura represents the data directly on the database, and databases are competent enough, especially Postgres, you are able to represent a very complex data model already without doing much work on top of it. The expressiveness of a GraphQL API generated by Hasura is very complex. On par with SQL, not directly, of course, but it's very similar competency. And having this layer already presented as a GraphQL API, it's very powerful. And permission layer on top of the data model is also a very useful way to mitigate problems that coming from unsafe code. So you can develop a data plane, and the data control across all application domains can be enforced to conform some security, let's say, layers. For example, you can directly involve some token-based authentication, even your application layer. So you can ask your application to hold the token of the client in order to access the data. Accessing the whole data is limited. Hasura allows you to give you that capabilities. So you are able to create a secure data plane immediately. And every time a new API is introduced, a new domain is introduced, there needs to be a convention out there. This is basically most of what GraphQL does, but Hasura facilitates us to actually represent our business domains in a unified manner. How does this work with Hasura, for example? I'm gonna describe 2 exemplary setups that we had for our existing clients. Hasura is the only data provider. We conform to 3-factor app. Everything that needs to be represented as a data goes through Hasura, and every action is actually restricted. So if you don't actually hold the right token for that data, doesn't matter who you are, developer or client, you're left out. App connects Hasura via remote schema and actions. So our business domains represents themselves within the data plane directly as a mutations or sometimes queries. And we are able to communicate each other, almost use it as a service discovery within the Hasura. And authentication is managed by Hasura. It's a simple abstraction of authorization layer. So when you really need to think about how a specific authorization is done in your application stack, you have one place to go, and it's basically, it makes your application harder to hack in by some unknown attack vectors, because you know where to secure, you know where to look at, and it kind of simplifies it. In the more advanced use cases, we can distribute the databases across the other domains. As I said, domains also should include, from my point of view, a very proper fintech should have also the data layer distributed across the domains. And there, Hasura also can help us because it's stateless. And being that stateless manner, we are able to replicate a Hasura-based setup across the whole data setup, and all domain can access the data layer within their boundaries. With that case, often the applications require a way to communicate with client in a very complex manner, and there you might require a security flow, an authorization flow that Hasura yet cannot provide. There we should use another authorization layer on top of our apps, but we should not sacrifice from what we have already on top of Hasura. What kind of lessons we learned while we are actually using Hasura, to be precise with? What did we realize after using Hasura? So there are some stuff that we knew that Hasura will give us, but what we learned that we didn't know, and we got to know this information or revelations after we started using Hasura. We realized that whatever domains you're dealing with, it is simple to re-implement what you did in another domain. Although you have some different microservices, different programming languages, that are simple, and compared to relearning a new practice, there is a simpler way to iterate and develop another domain, and you can actually develop multi-domain applications without much problems. You have a lean layer, you're looking at a single layer, and then there, Hasura does not introduce yet another complex layer to deal with. And agility does matter. If you're able to prototype your app fast and go very fast, just generating a full-fledged application from your prototype, you really differentiate yourself in a very regulated market. So far, we managed to use this methodologies using Hasura in different fintech cases. We managed to develop a credit application platform we developed the bank statement parsing, and we are actually building digital banking directly. And through these case studies, for example, our credit application use case, we managed to use Auth0 and integrate the client's authentication system, like Active Directory, using Microsoft Active Directory without much coding. Hasura actually gives us huge benefits on dealing with such complex use cases. So that's basically it from my side, and I'm more than happy to actually answer your questions.